Hello, I am Kharl Lloyd Suello, and I'm going to report about analytic tradition in philosophy. So let's go and let's learn together. What is analytic philosophy? Analytic philosophy has been the dominant academic philosophical movement in English speaking countries and in the Nordic countries from about the beginning of the 20th century up to about the 1970s or 1980s, and possibly since then. It is distinguished from continental philosophy, which takes its name from the European continent and is the dominant philosophy in most non English speaking countries. So, five phases in the development of analytical philosophy. So, first, it's the early analytic philosophy. Second, logical atheism. Third, logical positivism. Fourth, linguistic philosophy. And lastly, the modern analytic philosophy. So, logic and philosophy of language were central strands of analytic philosophy from the beginning, although this dominance diminished greatly in the later part of the 20th century. Several lines of thought originate from the early language and logic part of this analytic philosophy tradition. These include logical positivism or logical empiricism, logical atomism, lo- logicism, and ordinary language philosophy. The term analytic philosophy. So, the term analytic philosophy is slightly ambiguous and generally has three meanings: doctrine, method, and tradition. The doctrines, most often called analytic philosophy, are logical positivism and logical atomism. More loosely, the term can also refer to ordinary language philosophy, common sense philosophy, or some amalgam of the above. The method of analytic philosophy is a generalized approach to philosophy, originally associated with the projects of logical analysis. It nowadays emphasizes a clear, precise approach with particular weight being placed upon argumentation and evidence, avoidance of ambiguity, and attention to detail. The tradition of analytic philosophy began with Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, George Edward Moore at the turn of the 20th century, and just over a decade later with Ludwig Wittgenstein, and includes all those who work in their vein and on the various projects that have emerged out of the work of other analytic philosophers since. The appearance of analytic philosophy. So here, as we can see from George Edward Moore's, um, first it is criticism of idealism, second apology for common sense, and lastly the apology for ordinary language. So in the early phase of analytic philosophy, we see George Edward Moore's criticism of idealism as well as his apology for common sense and for the ordinary meanings of words. Moore criticizes metaphysicians for ignoring words' literal meanings. He says that their philosophical sentences are examples of different types of mistakes. Moore believes that our everyday language is more suitable for correct thinking than the sophisticated language of metaphysicians. Another important component of the first phase of the development of analytic philosophy is Russell's criticism of the monism of previous philosophy. So, here from Bertrand Russell's thoughts, first the criticism of monism and logicism. Another important component of the first phase of the development of analytic philosophy is Russell's criticism of the monism of previous philosophy. He argues that the idea of monism is logically irrelevant and is based on logical error. One of his arguments against monism is the idea that is false because of its unacceptable consequences for logic and mathematics. Logical atomism. Russell explains the term logical atomism in the following words. The reason that I call my doctrine logical atomism is because the atoms that I wish to arrive at as the sort of last residue in analysis are logical atoms and not physical atoms. Some of them will be what I call particulars, such things as little patches of color or sounds, momentary things, and some of them will be predicates or relations, and so on. Russell names the process of discovering these atoms logical analysis. Russell and Wittgenstein believe that the analysis of the nature of representation and logic relations opens the way to understanding major philosophical problems in the area of epistemology and metaphysics. Russell writes that the world contains facts, which are what they are, whatever we may choose to think about them, and that there are also beliefs which have reference to facts, and by reference to facts are either true or false. According to Russell, a fact is the kind of thing that makes a proposition true or false. For example, the proposition, "it is raining," is true in a certain condition of weather, so this condition of weather is the fact. Logical positivism. The Vienna Circle is founded by Moritz Schlick. Among its members are Kharl and other prominent thinkers. Logical positivists try to reconceptualize empiricism. The Vienna Circle's members offer the idea that verifiability in experience is the criterion of meaningfulness. According to positivists, it is crucial to understand that all metaphysical sentences are meaningless. In his treatise, Ayer emphasizes that it is necessary to understand the purpose and method of philosophy correctly. He argues that many metaphysical utterances are due to the commission of logical errors. He criticizes the metaphysical thesis that philosophy affords us knowledge of a reality that transcends the world of science and common sense. Ayer states that philosophy, as he understands it, can be entirely independent of metaphysics. Ayer also writes about verifiability as the criterion for testing the genuineness of apparent statements of fact. Let me give you his explanation of this criterion. We say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express, that is, if he knows that what observations would lead him, under certain conditions, to accept the propositions as being true or reject it as being false. Linguistic philosophy. The appearance of linguistic philosophy in the next significant event in the development of analytic philosophy. It is important not to confuse the terms linguistic philosophy and philosophy of language. John Searle clearly describes the difference between them in the following passage. The philosophy of language is the attempt to give an account of certain very general features of the structure, use, and functioning of language. Linguistic philosophy is the attempt to solve philosophical problems by using linguistic methods. The latter, Wittgenstein, starts the phase of linguistic philosophy. At this point, I want to highlight the fact that there are two periods Wittgenstein's philosophy between 1929 and 1932. His philosophical ideas undergo crucial changes. The early Wittgenstein tries to engage in the logical clarification of thoughts by analyzing the formal structure that is hidden by ordinary language. However, the latter Wittgenstein tries to solve philosophical issues by using linguistic analysis, analyzing the practical use of ordinary language and the aims and functions of different words. For example, Wittgenstein analyzes the practices by means of which children learn their native language. He discusses the duck rabbit figure, which can be seen either as a rabbit's head or as a duck. He discusses this figure, writing that it is necessary to distinguish between the continuous seeing of an aspect and the dawning of an aspect. Also, he addresses the grammar of the word know and the criteria which we accept for the terms fitting, being able to, and understanding. Moreover, he distinguishes surface grammar from depth grammar in the use of words. In addition, he shows the differences in grammar between the verbs to mean and to think. Wittgenstein introduces the term language game, seeking to stress the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity or of a form of life. So these are the two periods in Wittgenstein's philosophy. The early Wittgenstein, which analyzes the formal structure that is hidden by ordinary language, and the latter Wittgenstein analyzes the practical use of ordinary language. Wittgenstein criticizes philosophers for their sophisticated use of language structures. He writes, when philosophers use a word knowledge, being, object, I, proposition, name, and try to grasp the essence of the thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used in the way in the language game which is ordinarily home? What we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. In their concern regarding ordinary language, the latter Wittgenstein's theories have some. That would be all for the presentation. And before we end this video, I just want to share what I learned about analytic tradition. So for me, analytic tradition is more on breaking down what is the thought of that certain philosophy. To be able for us to break down, we must consider that before we discuss the reason behind the science, let's question what is the very basic that you should know if, for you to be able to understand the truth or the logic. So that is what I discussed. The number one thing is the language. So without deep knowledge of language, well, you understand nothing. And that will be all. And that's all for analytic tradition philosophy. I hope you